The screen door of 412 creaked in the cold December wind, carrying her mother's razor-sharp words, "If Clara is coming, she'd better have her checkbook." Clara froze on the cracked concrete step, letting the first heavy snowfall of Blackwood, Pennsylvania, settle quietly onto the shoulders of her coat. The drab gray wool, a hasty $20 purchase from a thrift store back in Chicago, did little to block the biting winter chill that seemed to seep straight through to her bones. Her bare fingers tightened around the handle of her battered suitcase, its front zipper completely broken and the canvas fraying at the edges. Every scuff and tear on the luggage was a necessary prop in the quiet, desperate play she had been rehearsing since her flight crossed the Ohio state line. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, pulling in a slow, freezing breath that smelled faintly of distant pine and burning wood smoke. Somewhere in the deep pocket of her coat rested her smartphone, holding a hidden digital spreadsheet simply titled Family. The final tally resting at the bottom of the screen sat at exactly $184,600. That was the staggering sum she had wired to this house over the last decade. It was paid for with years of instant ramen dinners right out of college, skipped vacations, and countless sleepless nights climbing the corporate ladder. It was enough money to buy a modest home outright in a quiet suburb, but she had sent it here, hoping it might act as a down payment on a little genuine affection. Yet, it seemed all those monthly wire transfers were still not enough to purchase her a seat as a real member of this family. Swallowing the bitter lump forming in her throat, Clara reached out and firmly pressed the doorbell. Heavy, shuffling footsteps approached before the thick wooden door finally swung inward. Martha, her mother, stood in the threshold with a faded floral apron draped casually over her shoulder. Her eyes didn't light up with the sudden, undeniable warmth of a mother welcoming her youngest daughter home for the holidays. Instead, they darted in a familiar, calculating scan. Martha's gaze flicked critically over Clara's wind-tossed hair, dragged down the cheap fabric of the coat, and landed with a silent, heavy thud on the pathetic suitcase. The obligatory, polite hostess smile immediately vanished from her face. Martha's brow furrowed deeply as she peered out at the empty, snow-dusted street behind her daughter. "Where is your rental car?" Martha asked, her voice as dry and brittle as autumn leaves. "I took a cab from the airport," Clara replied, forcing a slight, nervous tremor into her voice to perfectly play the part of a woman pushed to the financial brink. Martha's lips pressed together into a thin, bloodless line. With a heavy, dramatic sigh, she stepped aside, reluctantly allowing her daughter into the narrow foyer. The house smelled exactly the same as it had 20 years ago, a mixture of old fireplace ash and roasting butter, a scent that triggered 100 childhood memories, none of them particularly comforting. At the small kitchen table sat Arthur, her father. The former cigar factory foreman was hunched over the local Blackwood Courier, adjusting his reading glasses low on his nose. He didn't bother to look up from the sports section. There was no sudden scrape of the chair, no warm embrace, no proud smile. He simply raised one hand in a half-hearted, dismissive wave, as if acknowledging the mail carrier dropping off a catalog. In the adjacent living room, Clara's older sister, Sylvia, was curled up comfortably on the floral sofa. Sylvia had lived rent-free in the guest edition outback for 12 straight years, yet carried herself like local royalty. She was meticulously painting her nails an electric blue, barely sparing Clara a sideways glance before going right back to blowing gently on her wet fingertips. Clara pulled out a wooden chair and sat down at the kitchen table. Martha silently set a mug of weak, steaming Folgers coffee in front of her. Then came the question, arriving right on schedule, skipping past any basic human pleasantries. "So, how is the job?" Martha asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Not, how are you holding up?" "Never, are you okay?" Clara wrapped her cold, stiff hands around the warm ceramic mug, feeling the heat seep into her palms. She looked across the table at her parents, holding their gaze before letting the rehearsed words fall. "I need to tell you all something. The subsidiary I was managing went under. I lost my position entirely. I I have nothing right now. The kitchen instantly plunged into a suffocating silence. The steady rustle of Arthur's newspaper abruptly stopped. His eyes narrowed sharply behind his thick lenses, completely devoid of any parental concern. It was the harsh look of a man calculating a sudden, catastrophic loss on a ledger. Martha slowly lowered her own coffee mug to the table, her jaw tense. 5 agonizing seconds ticked by on the vintage clock hanging above the refrigerator. Arthur was the first to speak. So, what about the mortgage payment next month? Martha quickly patted her husband's arm to quiet him, but immediately leaned across the table toward Clara, her eyes urgent and demanding. Honey, how long do you honestly think it will take before you find something new? From the living room, Sylvia's mocking laugh sliced through the heavy air, shattering whatever fragile illusion of home was left. Called it, Sylvia sang out, not even bothering to look up from her nails. I always told Mom that your flashy corporate life was just a house of cards waiting to fall. Clara took a slow sip of the bitter coffee. Not a single person in the room asked if she was terrified. No one wondered how she would eat, where she would sleep, or if she needed a shoulder to lean on. Her father was only terrified about his loan. Her mother was demanding a strict timeline for her financial recovery. Her sister was actively gloating. Clara carefully catalogued every word, every shift in posture, and every glaring absence of love. She sat there steady and composed, because she had prepared herself for the disappointment, but she never could have anticipated the sickening scheme they were hiding in the study. Before we discover exactly what her family is hiding in that study, I'd like to take a quick moment. If you are still watching and finding Clara's journey meaningful, please drop the number 8 in the comments below just to let me know you're here with us. And if you haven't joined our community yet, I warmly invite you to subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss a video. Your wonderful support is what helps us continue creating great content to inform and inspire you. Now, let's get back to Clara, and let's continue the story. Saturday morning did not begin with a warm cup of coffee, but with a long, demanding list of chores pressed firmly into Clara's hands. Martha had met her at the bottom of the stairs before the sun even fully crested over the Pennsylvania hills. There was no gentle inquiry about how she had slept on the lumpy, sagging cot in the dusty corner of what used to be her own bedroom. Instead, Martha shoved a piece of ruled notebook paper toward her. It was an ambitious list of 12 tasks for the neighborhood Christmas barbecue, a bizarre Blackwood tradition where Arthur insisted on grilling in freezing temperatures just to prove his rugged hospitality. Clara tied a frayed, grease-stained apron over her cheap wool coat and stepped out onto the back patio. The biting December wind immediately whipped across her face. The yard was a messy sheet of compacted snow and ice, and her first task was to chip it away so the guests wouldn't slip. For 2 agonizing hours, she dragged the heavy iron snow shovel across the concrete, her breath plumping in the frigid air, her muscles aching in protest. Inside the warm, brightly lit kitchen, she could see Sylvia leisurely pouring herself a tall glass of orange juice. Sylvia had an appointment at the local salon later that morning, a luxury she claimed was essential for the holiday season, despite contributing absolutely nothing to the household expenses. By 11 o'clock, the yard was set up. Folding chairs formed a semicircle around the rusted charcoal grill, and outdoor heaters stood ready to battle the winter chill. Sylvia finally made her grand entrance onto the porch, wrapped in a plush, cream-colored designer coat, her hair perfectly blown out. She leaned against the wooden railing, holding a steaming mug of hot cider, and watched Clara struggle to haul a massive bag of charcoal from the garage. So, Sylvia called out, her voice sharp and carrying easily over the wind. The great financial prodigy finally crashed and burned. I always told Mom you were faking it. Clara paused, letting the heavy bag rest against her knee. Good morning to you too, Sylvia. Don't act so high and mighty, Sylvia sneered, taking a slow, dramatic sip of her cider. You always thought you were better than us just because you ran off to the city to play businesswoman. But look at you now. Right back where you started, hauling dirt in Dad's backyard. Clara didn't argue. She simply ripped the heavy paper bag open and poured the briquettes into the grill, knowing that arguing with her sister was a game where the only winning move was not to play. Shortly after noon, the yard filled with heavily bundled neighbors. The air grew thick with the smell of lighter fluid, roasting meat, and cheap beer. Clara manned the grill, her face tight from the smoke and the cold. She watched her father work the crowd. Arthur was in his absolute element, shaking hands and clapping backs, specifically zeroing in on Bill Henderson, a loan officer at the regional bank. When Mr. Henderson wandered over to the grill to grab a hot dog, he noticed Clara. "You must be the girl Arthur is always bragging about," Mr. Henderson said with a warm, genuine smile. "He says you've got a real head for the corporate world." Before Clara could even open her mouth to reply, Arthur materialized at her elbow, his face flushed. "She's just taking a little sabbatical, Bill," Arthur said loudly, aggressively clapping Clara on the shoulder. "Recharging the batteries. You know how stressful the city gets." He lied without skipping a single beat. He knew exactly what she had told them the night before, that she had lost everything, but he would rather fabricate a glamorous vacation than admit his daughter was struggling. He wasn't embarrassed for her, he was embarrassed of her. Clara quietly excused herself from the grill, carrying a stack of empty paper plates toward the edge of the property. As she neared the chain-link fence, a soft, familiar voice called out, "Clara, honey, come here for a second." It was Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow who had lived next door for over 30 years. She was wrapped in a thick, hand-knitted shawl, standing on her side of the property line. Unlike Martha's calculating scans, Mrs. Patterson's eyes were full of a deep, unconditional warmth. She reached over the cold metal fence and pressed a small, heavy package wrapped in aluminum foil into Clara's hands. "Fresh pumpkin bread, right out of the oven," Mrs. Patterson whispered, her wrinkled face breaking into a beautiful smile. "You look frozen solid, sweetheart. You've been working out here all morning. Take a minute and eat." Clara felt a sudden, unexpected tightness in her throat. The foil radiated heat against her numb palms. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. That's very kind of you. You are always welcome at my table, dear. Don't you ever forget that," the older woman said softly, giving Clara's hand a reassuring squeeze before turning back toward her own house. The pure, uncomplicated kindness of the gesture lingered with Clara as she walked back toward the garage to drop the trash bag. As she rounded the corner of the wooden shed, she heard a hushed, desperate voice. She stopped in her tracks. Arthur was pacing in the narrow alley between the shed and the house, his cell phone pressed tightly to his ear. "I just need a little more time," Arthur was pleading, all his previous bravado completely stripped away. "I know the notice said 5 months delinquent, but I can get the account current. Just don't start the foreclosure process before the new year. Please." Clara stood perfectly still, the cold winter air burning in her lungs. 5 months delinquent. 5 months behind on the mortgage. The math immediately flared to life in her mind. She had been wiring them $500 on the first of every single month for 10 years. If they were 5 months behind on the house, where had all that money actually gone? Using the excuse of grabbing more ice, Clara stepped back inside the house and unwittingly pushed open the door to the darkest, most carefully hidden corner of this family. Some secrets are hidden in locked safes, but in this house, they were carelessly left on Arthur's cluttered desk. The biting cold of the backyard and the hushed, desperate phone call about the missing mortgage money formed a chilling puzzle that Clara was about to solve in the worst way possible. She had stepped back inside the house under the guise of refilling the large plastic cooler with ice from the chest freezer. The interior of the home was blissfully quiet, a stark contrast to the loud, performative cheer her father was currently projecting out on the snow-covered patio. She walked slowly down the narrow, dimly lit hallway toward the utility room, her cheap wool coat still wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Passing her father's home office, a small, cramped room that perpetually smelled of stale cigar smoke, old newsprint, and lemon polish, she noticed the heavy oak door had been left slightly ajar. Clara normally would never have stopped. She wouldn't have even looked inside, respecting the strict boundaries Arthur had always drawn around his personal space. But a flash of crisp, white paper caught her eye, standing out against the dark, messy expanse of his mahogany desk. It was an envelope, torn open in a sloppy hurry, resting right on the corner next to a pile of unpaid utility bills. She took a cautious step into the room. The return address printed in the upper left corner belonged to one of the largest national credit card issuers in the country. That alone wasn't unusual for a man struggling with mounting debt. But it was the name printed clearly in the plastic window of the envelope that made the breath catch in her throat. Clara E. Ingram. Her hand trembled just a fraction of an inch as she reached out and picked up the folded document. It was a standard monthly credit card statement. The billing address was listed plainly, 412 Maple Street, Blackwood, Pennsylvania. Her parents' house. She had lived in Chicago for 10 years. She had never opened an account with this bank, and she certainly had never requested that mail be sent to her childhood home. She flipped to the second page, her eyes instinctively shifting into the analytical mode that made her a formidable chief financial officer. The numbers painted a devastating picture. There was a revolving balance of $6,200 against a total credit limit of $8,000. The itemized transaction history from the past 30 days read like a catalog of indulgent luxuries. There were multiple charges at an upscale nail salon downtown, the exact same salon where Sylvia had spent her morning getting her electric blue manicure. There were significant purchases at a boutique clothing store in the next county over, the likely source of Martha's plush new designer coat. There were charges for high-end cosmetics, expensive restaurant dinners, and decorative home goods. These were not emergency expenses. This wasn't money used to fix a broken water heater, repair a leaking roof, or even pay down the 5 months of delinquent mortgage payments Arthur had been begging the bank about. This was pure, unadulterated vanity, funded entirely by a piece of plastic bearing her stolen name. She noticed that the monthly minimum payments had been made just frequently enough to keep the account out of default and off her personal credit report, though the last 2 billing cycles had been skipped entirely. For a long moment, the only sound in the suffocating little office was the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Clara didn't gasp. She didn't sink to the floor, and she didn't break down into weeping tears. The raw, searing pain of being an unloved daughter was suddenly and permanently eclipsed by the cold, hard reality of the crime resting in her hands. Clara realized she wasn't just unloved, she was being actively exploited. They hadn't just taken the hundreds of thousands of dollars she had willingly wired them out of a misguided sense of filial duty. That wasn't enough for them. They had crossed a legal and moral line, actively stealing her identity to fund a lifestyle they could not afford. They had converted her pristine credit score and her hard-earned name into their own personal slush fund, without a single moment of hesitation, consultation, or guilt. They treated her like a human bank account, withdrawing from her life while simultaneously mocking her supposed downfall in the backyard. Moving with the precise, methodical calm of a seasoned executive who had just uncovered a corporate embezzlement scheme, Clara pulled her smartphone from her deep coat pocket. She opened the camera application and began taking high-resolution photographs. She documented page 1, page 2, the torn envelope, and the fine print of the terms and conditions. She made sure the desk lamp illuminated the text perfectly, ensuring every single fraudulent charge was legible. Once she had meticulously captured every piece of evidence, she carefully placed the statement back onto the desk. She matched the exact angle it had been sitting at, replicated the slight crease in the paper, and restored the casual, arrogant disregard with which it had been left out in the open. She turned off her phone screen and took one last look around the smoky, oppressive little room that held so many of her father's lies. She slipped her phone back into her pocket, the true weight of her family's deception finally setting her free. Before we see exactly how Clara handles this heartbreaking discovery, I'd like to take a brief pause. If you are still watching and finding value in the details of this story, please type the number 1 in the comments below just to let me know you're here. I would also love for you to share a meaningful thought or a warm wish for Clara. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I highly recommend joining our community and tapping that notification bell so you never miss a video. Your wonderful support is what helps us continue creating great content to inform and inspire you. Now, let's head back out to the yard, and let's continue the story. When you no longer have any value to be exploited, family will not hesitate to throw you into the fire to keep their own pride warm. The digital photographs of the fraudulent credit card statement burned like a quiet, steady ember in her coat pocket as she walked back out into the freezing backyard. The sun had completely dropped behind the Pennsylvania hills, replacing the gray afternoon with an ink-black winter sky. The decorative holiday lights strung along the gutters finally flickered to life, casting an artificial, multicolored glow over the heavy wool coats of the gathered neighbors. The festive music blaring from a portable speaker felt like a cruel joke against the backdrop of the icy air and the chilling truth Clara had just uncovered in her father's study. She moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of a woman used to navigating high-stakes boardrooms, carrying the heavy bag of ice she had retrieved from the freezer. She dumped it into the large plastic cooler by the fence, wiping the frost from her numb fingers. Before she could even turn around, Arthur materialized beside her. His breath plumed in the cold air, carrying the sharp scent of stale beer and desperation. "Clara, come here," he muttered, gripping her elbow far too tightly. He yanked her slightly out of the crowd, steering her toward the corner where Bill Henderson, the local bank manager, was nursing a dark stout. "Listen to me," Arthur hissed under his breath, his eyes darting nervously around the yard. "I need you to go over there and talk to Bill. Use that fancy finance vocabulary of yours. Impress him. Tell him you're going to help us restructure, or guarantee the loan, or whatever it is you people do. I need a grace period on the house." Clara looked at the man who had raised her. She looked at the fraying collar of his flannel shirt and the deep lines of panic etched around his eyes. "I can't do that, Dad," she said, her voice perfectly level and entirely devoid of the panic he was exhibiting. "I told you last night. I lost my job. I have absolutely nothing." Arthur's jaw tightened. The facade of the jovial neighborhood host instantly crumbled, revealing the raw, ugly panic beneath. He didn't care about her supposed unemployment, he only cared that his human safety net was refusing to catch him. "I don't care about your excuses," he snapped, his voice rising above the country music. "I need you to fix this." "I am not in a position to fix your mistakes," Clara replied, refusing to break eye contact. Arthur's face flushed a dangerous, mottled crimson. The alcohol and the fear finally boiled over, stripping away his last shred of dignity. He took a step back, intentionally raising his voice so that the radius of neighbors standing near the grill could hear every single word. "You were never really part of this family anyway, Clara," he spat, the words ringing out into the crisp night air. "You packed up and left for the city the second you could. You abandoned us. Sylvia stayed. That is the difference." The yard didn't go completely silent, that only happens in movies, but an agonizing, awkward hush fell over the immediate area. Bill Henderson suddenly found his boots very interesting. Other neighbors stopped chewing, their eyes darting uncomfortably between father and daughter. Martha, standing near the patio door with a tray of cold appetizers, did not rush forward to defend her youngest child. She merely looked away, completely complicit in the execution. From her comfortable perch on a lawn chair, Sylvia let out a loud, theatrical sigh, swirling the remaining cider in her cup. "Don't feel bad for her," Sylvia announced to the shocked onlookers. "She always thought she was too good for Blackwood. Karma is just doing its job." Clara stood her ground. She didn't scream, and she didn't weep. She simply looked at her father, taking in the full measure of the man who had just classified his own flesh and blood as a write-off to save his pride. She smoothed the front of her cheap wool coat, turned on her heel, and walked away from the grill. But she didn't walk back into the house at 412 Maple Street. She walked directly toward the property line. Standing at her back door, Mrs. Patterson had witnessed the entire brutal exchange. The elderly woman didn't offer a look of pity, she offered one of profound sorrow. Without saying a word, Mrs. Patterson pushed open her screen door and reached out a frail, warm hand. Clara took it, stepping out of the freezing backyard and into the soft, dimly lit warmth of her neighbor's kitchen. The contrast was staggering. Mrs. Patterson's home smelled of cinnamon and old books. The elderly woman gently guided Clara into a plush armchair right beside a crackling fireplace. She didn't ask probing questions. She didn't demand explanations. She simply poured a cup of hot chamomile tea, set it gently on the small table beside Clara, and spoke the words Clara's own mother had failed to deliver for 32 years. "You are always welcome here, exactly as you are," Mrs. Patterson said softly, her eyes crinkling with genuine affection. Clara wrapped her hands around the warm teacup, letting the unconditional kindness thaw the ice that had formed around her heart. She sat in the quiet comfort for several long minutes, breathing in the safety of the room. When her hands finally stopped trembling, not from fear but from the sheer adrenaline of sudden, absolute clarity, she stood up. Excusing herself to the quiet hallway, she pulled the smartphone from her pocket and dialed a number she knew by heart. The line clicked open in Chicago. "Find out who holds the mortgage on 412 Maple Street in Blackwood," she ordered her attorney over the phone. "I want to buy it outright." 3 weeks later, the thrift store suitcase was gone, replaced by a tailored suit and a leather briefcase. The sleek black town car idled quietly against the curb of Maple Street, its exhaust pluming in the crisp January air. Clara stepped out onto the familiar cracked concrete of the walkway, her posture entirely transformed. The cheap wool coat had been discarded, traded for a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal blazer and matching trousers. The warmth of Mrs. Patterson's chamomile tea from that freezing holiday night had given Clara the strength to finally do what was necessary, washing away decades of misplaced guilt. Beside her walked Marcus, her lead corporate attorney from Chicago, his expression politely neutral as he carried his heavy leather briefcase up the steps of the Blackwood home. Arthur opened the front door before they even reached the porch. He was wearing his usual faded flannel, his brow furrowed in deep irritation. When he saw the pristine town car and the formidable man in the expensive suit standing next to his daughter, his annoyance faltered, replaced by a sudden, confused apprehension. He stepped aside without a word, allowing them into the narrow foyer. The kitchen looked exactly as it had 3 weeks prior. Martha was wiping down the laminate counters, while Sylvia leaned against the refrigerator, scrolling lazily through her phone. As Clara and Marcus entered the room, the casual Saturday morning atmosphere evaporated. Martha's rag stopped moving. Sylvia slowly lowered her phone. Clara did not take a seat at the table. She stood tall, meeting her father's eyes. 3 weeks ago, Clara began, her voice calm, resonant, and entirely devoid of the trembling hesitation she had feigned during her last visit. "I stood in this exact room and told you I had lost everything. Dad, your very first question was about how I would cover your mortgage payment. Mom, you demanded a strict timeline for when I would start earning again. Sylvia, you went out into the backyard and told 20 neighbors that my downfall was karma." Martha wiped her hands nervously on her apron, taking a tentative step forward. "Clara, honey, we were just shocked." "I didn't lose my job," Clara interrupted smoothly, slicing through the excuse before it could fully form. "My company did not fold. I am the chief financial officer of a major private equity firm in Chicago. I manage a portfolio larger than the annual budget of this entire town." The silence in the kitchen was absolute. Sylvia pushed off the refrigerator, her mouth falling open. Martha's hands flew to her chest, her eyes wide with a sudden, greedy realization. But before Martha could attempt to pivot and play the role of a proud mother, Marcus set his briefcase flat on the kitchen table. The sharp snap of the brass latches echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Here is what happens next," Clara said, gesturing to the table. Marcus extracted a thin manila folder and laid 3 pages of high-resolution printed photographs across the table. It was the credit card statement Clara had found in the study. "We have the physical statements and the digital records, Mr. Ingram," Marcus said, his professional tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. This account was opened using Clara's social security number, establishing this address as the primary billing location. Under Pennsylvania state law and federal statute, this is identity fraud. It carries severe criminal penalties. Arthur's face drained of all color. He looked from the photographs to Clara, his jaw working but no sound coming out. Sylvia shrank back against the refrigerator, suddenly acutely aware of her fresh manicure and expensive boots. "I am choosing not to pursue criminal charges," Clara said, letting the words hang heavily in the air. "However, you have 90 days to pay the remaining $6,200 balance in full, and close the account permanently." Martha let out a shaky breath, clearly thinking they had dodged a bullet. "Of course, Clara. We'll handle it. We just got a little behind, that's all." "I am not finished," Clara said. Marcus pulled a second document from the briefcase. It was a heavy legal contract, stamped and notarized. He slid it precisely across the table, stopping it directly in front of Arthur. "Your mortgage was 5 months delinquent," Marcus explained evenly. "The original lender packaged your non-performing loan into a secondary market portfolio. Clara's firm purchased that note at a discount last Thursday. She is now the legal creditor on this property." Sylvia gasped loudly. "You bought our house. You're going to throw your own family out on the street." Clara turned her gaze to her older sister, her expression unyielding. "Sylvia, you have been living in the guest house out back for 12 years without paying a single dime toward the mortgage, the property taxes, or the utilities. If anyone in this room should be deeply concerned about their living arrangements, it is you." Sylvia snapped her mouth shut, genuine fear finally replacing her lifelong entitlement. Clara looked back at her parents. "I am not here for revenge. I am here to formally end an arrangement that never should have existed. The terms are simple. You will sign a restructured payment agreement today. The monthly payments will be routed directly through Marcus's law office. Sylvia will begin paying $300 a month in rent to help you cover that cost. If you miss 3 consecutive payments, my office will initiate foreclosure proceedings automatically. No extensions. No excuses." Martha's face contorted, her voice pitching up into the familiar, dramatic shrill she used to rewrite history. "After everything I sacrificed for you. I stayed up nights when you were sick. I put food on this table. How can you stand there and treat us like strangers? Because providing the basic, legal necessities for a child does not entitle you to commit financial fraud against them as an adult," Clara stated, her voice remarkably gentle, yet unshakable. "You treated me like a transaction for a decade. Now, we are simply putting it in writing." There was nothing left to say. Clara didn't wait for apologies she knew wouldn't be genuine, nor did she wait for them to pick up the pens. She had delivered her terms. She turned around and walked out the front door, leaving the suffocating weight of 412 Maple Street behind her forever. Arthur stared at the paperwork, finally realizing the daughter he discarded was the only one holding their roof up. You can't change the rules of a rigged game, but you can always choose to walk away from the table. Arthur's jagged signature on the heavy legal documents back in Pennsylvania was the final period at the end of a very long, painful sentence. 6 months had passed since the crisp January morning when Clara had formally foreclosed on her family's sense of entitlement. Now, it was a brilliantly sunny Tuesday in early June, and Clara was sitting comfortably on the expansive balcony of her high-rise condo in downtown Chicago. The roar of the city below was a steady, rhythmic hum, a sound she had once associated with the relentless, grinding pressure of her corporate career. Today, however, it sounded entirely different. It sounded like the beautiful, unbroken soundtrack of her hard-won independence. She wasn't just surviving anymore, constantly waiting for the next financial crisis to summon her home. She was finally breathing. Her smartphone buzzed quietly against the glass surface of the patio table. Clara glanced down at the illuminated screen. It was an automated email notification forwarded from Marcus's law firm. Payment received, $1,247, Arthur Ingram. It was the 6th consecutive month the payment had arrived precisely on schedule. According to Marcus's brief updates, Arthur had quietly swallowed his immense pride and taken a part-time job stocking shelves at a local auto parts store to make the new mortgage terms. Sylvia, stripped of her 12-year free ride, was grudgingly handing over her $300 in rent every first of the month, complaining loudly to anyone who would listen, but paying nonetheless. A few minutes after the email arrived, a text message popped up from her father. 4 simple words. No apologies for the past, no excuses for the present, just, payment sent on time. It wasn't an expression of love, but it was an expression of respect. For a family that had only ever communicated in the cold language of transactions and leverage, it was the closest thing to healthy boundaries Clara could ever expect. She didn't reply to the message, but she didn't delete it either. But setting those ironclad boundaries with her family wasn't the only piece of business Clara had conducted before leaving Blackwood for good. Her thoughts drifted gently back to that freezing December night, away from the cruel mockery of the backyard barbecue, and into the soft, welcoming glow of the fireplace next door. Mrs. Patterson hadn't known that Clara was the chief financial officer of a major capital firm. The elderly widow had looked at a shivering, seemingly heartbroken woman standing in a cheap, frayed thrift store coat and offered her the absolute best seat at her table. She had poured hot chamomile tea and offered genuine, uncomplicated comfort without asking for a single thing in return. True kindness, Clara had learned that night, was completely unconditional. It didn't demand a strict timeline for recovery, it didn't judge a person by the brand of their coat, and it certainly didn't keep a running ledger of debts to be weaponized later. Before boarding her return flight to Chicago all those months ago, Clara had asked Marcus to make a quiet, thorough inquiry into the public county records regarding Mrs. Patterson. The attorney quickly discovered that the sweet elderly neighbor had been struggling under the crushing weight of several outstanding medical bills from a recent knee surgery. Mrs. Patterson had been quietly sacrificing her own basic comforts, turning down her heat, skipping meals, just to make the minimum monthly payments to the hospital. Clara hadn't confronted the widow or made a grand, boastful gesture to show off her wealth. She had simply directed Marcus to pay off the entire medical debt anonymously through a private charitable trust, wiping the slate completely clean in a matter of hours. The phone buzzed a third time, breaking her peaceful reverie. This time, it wasn't an automated banking alert. The caller ID flashed a familiar Pennsylvania area code. Clara picked up the phone and answered on the second ring. Hello. Clara, sweetheart, is that you? Mrs. Patterson's voice trembled through the receiver, thick with overwhelming emotion. I just got a certified letter from the hospital administration. They told me an anonymous donor cleared my entire account. Every last penny is gone. I don't know how, and the lawyer on the phone absolutely refused to give me a name, but he sounded awfully like that nice, well-dressed gentleman who was walking up your parents' driveway. A soft, breathless sob of pure relief escaped the older woman. I just wanted to call and see how you were doing in the city, dear. I pray for you every single day. Clara smiled, feeling a profound, radiant warmth bloom in her chest that had absolutely nothing to do with the bright summer sun overhead. I'm doing wonderfully, Mrs. Patterson. Better than I have in a very long time. Please, use that extra money to buy yourself something beautiful for your hydrangea garden this year. When the call finally ended, Clara set the phone face down on the table. She had spent over a decade frantically trying to buy the love of people who only saw her as a walking checkbook, entirely missing the quiet, unassuming grace of those who valued her simply for existing. Kindness didn't need to be earned through exhaustion, and it certainly didn't need to be financed. It was a gift, freely given, and wonderfully returned. Clara took a sip of her coffee, looking out at the city, knowing her heart was finally full. Clara's journey from a freezing porch to a sunlit balcony reminds us that our true worth is never defined by those who refuse to see it, but by the quiet grace we choose to accept and give. As the author, watching Clara find her peace, not in loud vengeance, but in the unconditional warmth of a neighbor's simple cup of tea, reinforced a truth I hold dear: the strongest boundaries we build are paved with self-respect, and the deepest healing often comes from unexpected kindness. When we stop measuring people by the frayed seams of their coats, we finally make room for genuine human connection. If Clara's path to reclaiming her dignity resonated with a chapter of your own life, I would love to hear your reflections in the comments below. And if this journey touched your heart, please consider subscribing to Retribution Raw to join our community for more deeply human stories, because sometimes, the sweetest retribution is simply choosing to live a beautiful, unburdened life.